Chapter 1. The Room with a False Bottom. In the small town of Brooklyn, Minnesota, the streets in early autumn were lined with aging maples, their leaves turning brittle gold and copper. Clara Andrews had only recently unpacked the last of her boxes in the modest cottage she inherited from her grandmother, a weathered home with creaky stairs and a quiet charm. The house sat at the edge of town, near a frozen pond that would later mirror the sky in winter. It was quiet there, and for someone like Clara, quiet was both comfort and curse. She was 31, lived alone, and worked as a library systems specialist at the county university. Her life moved with the careful rhythm of routines: early morning walks, soft instrumental music during breakfast, long afternoons spent among old catalogs and digitization software. Most people who knew Clara saw her as kind, dependable, reserved. But beneath the gentle exterior, there was a constant sense of unease, something like a low hum she could never quite silence. That unease had a name: Grace Andrews, her mother. Grace was everything Clara was not. Polished, outspoken, admired, a local psychologist with a weekly column in the community paper and an Instagram account full of curated wisdom and posed smiles. At city events, Grace's presence drew attention. People listened when she spoke. They trusted her. To the outside world, she was composed and benevolent, but Clara knew the truth was colder. Since childhood, Clara had lived under her mother's scrutiny. Love was something granted and withheld like a privilege. Mistakes were archived, emotions were redirected. Praise came with conditions. Grace used words like scalpels, never violent, but always cutting. From an early age, Clara had been told she was difficult, unlovable, too much, and not enough at the same time. Her mother never said it outright, but the message was clear. No one would ever love her the way Grace did, and no one ever had. Clara had tried. She had dated. She had opened herself to people only to watch them vanish without warning. Relationships that began with connection always ended with silence, ghosted without cause, explanations, or closure. She blamed herself for years. But something shifted when she ran into Gavin at the grocery store. Gavin, the one who had disappeared 2 years ago after weeks of what she thought was deep affection. He looked startled to see her, uncomfortable, and then he blurted out something that stuck to her like thorns. He said someone had contacted him back then, anonymously, and warned him about her past, about alleged incidents she'd never experienced, secrets that weren't hers. They had spooked him. He had believed them. And so he left. That night, Clara lay awake, replaying every interaction, every rupture. She wasn't sure why, but her mind drifted to the attic of her grandmother's house. Something about the smell of that space, the way it held things untouched for decades, pulled her like a thread. Around midnight, she climbed the narrow stairs with a flashlight in hand. The attic was cold and dusty, filled with the scent of aged wood and forgotten belongings. Under an old cedar chest, she noticed a loose floorboard. She pried it up gently, heart thudding in her throat. Beneath the board, tucked into a cloth bag that smelled faintly of lavender, were 5 leather-bound notebooks. They were written in her mother's hand, and what Clara read changed everything. Chapter 2. The Trap You're Born Into. Clara spent hours reading the journals, sitting cross-legged on the attic floor with only the faint light of a single hanging bulb casting shadows around her. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, upright, the product of a woman who never tolerated chaos. The contents, however, were anything but orderly. Each entry unfolded like a clinical report. Grace had documented Clara's life, not as a mother recounting memories, but as an observer dissecting a subject. The tone was detached, analytical, even coldly fascinated. Clara found herself referred to not as a daughter, but as the anchor, the subject, the emotional fulcrum. Her mother wrote that Clara lacked the psychological capacity for real intimacy, that she was prone to obsessive attachment, that her emotions were erratic and self-destructive. Grace described her daughter's romantic relationships as threat scenarios requiring intervention. She listed names, dates, behavioral notes. She wrote of her pride in preventing long-term damage. She praised herself for protecting Clara from inevitable collapse. Each line tightened something in Clara's chest. What she had interpreted as fate, as poor judgment or bad luck, now stood revealed as the result of design. Her failed relationships weren't random or unfortunate. They had been orchestrated collapses. And behind each quiet disappearance, each abrupt breakup, was a mother who had played puppeteer from behind the curtain. Clara began searching for evidence. She logged into old email accounts, phone records, anything she could still access. Within hours, she began seeing patterns. Password change alerts from unfamiliar devices, anonymous emails to former partners, crafted with just enough truth to sound believable, but laced with innuendo, warnings, and outright lies. She traced one IP address to her mother's home network. There were call logs filled with spoofed numbers, blocked IDs, and text messages that matched the timeline of several breakups. It wasn't a theory anymore, it was proof. The deeper Clara went, the more grotesque the picture became. Her mother had sent messages posing as friends, exes, even therapists. She had planted doubts, whispered lies, and seeded fear in anyone who got too close. Clara felt sick. It wasn't just sabotage, it was obsession, a possessiveness so complete it consumed every possibility of love, every path to freedom. But what disturbed Clara most was the oldest journal, the one dating back to when her father was still alive. The pages shifted in tone, almost like a descent into something darker. Grace wrote of fractured alliances and the threat of male influence. She described her husband's growing distance, his concern over her parenting, his suggestions that Clara deserved more independence. Then, abruptly, he vanished from the pages. There was no grief, no mourning, just a single line. Unburdened at last. Her father had died in a hiking accident when Clara was 13. He fell from a ridge trail he'd walked dozens of times. Everyone said it was a tragic misstep. But now, Clara's memory dredged up pieces she hadn't thought of in years. His anxious glances at Grace during dinner, the locked office drawer he never let Clara open, the way he once whispered to her, "You'll understand when you're older." Now she did. Her entire life had been framed by invisible bars, a loving prison designed to look like protection. Every relationship, every moment of independence had been perceived by Grace as a threat to the bond she had engineered between them. And she had neutralized every threat with surgical precision. Clara sat alone in the attic until dawn, her hands numb, her pulse irregular. She realized then that this wasn't just a story about a mother and daughter. It was about survival. She had been raised inside a trap that masqueraded as home. And unless she found a way to dismantle it, piece by calculated piece, she would never be free. Chapter 3. Behind a borrowed mirror. The office break room was nearly empty when Clara first told Laura. She spoke in a hushed voice, hesitant and careful, unsure how her words might sound outside the echo chamber of her own mind. Laura listened without blinking. A cybersecurity analyst turned librarian, she had once been known in underground tech forums for her ability to extract metadata from air-gapped systems and trace digital footprints that others swore were untraceable. To Clara, she was the only person who might understand the invisible war she had discovered. They started small. The plan needed to be watertight, no room for coincidence, no space for denial. They created a man. His name was Dylan Marlowe. He had a carefully curated digital presence, a LinkedIn profile that suggested he worked in marketing, a modest Instagram account with a mix of dog photos, coffee cups, and sunset shots, and a Twitter profile that liked just enough of Clara's posts to appear engaged. Laura generated his photo using AI tools, blending features that made him handsome but not too memorable, approachable but not bland. Next came the illusion of intimacy. Clara began referencing Dylan in casual conversations with coworkers, leaving post-it notes with his name around her home. She even ordered a bouquet of flowers addressed from him, delivered on a Sunday afternoon when she knew Grace was expected for tea. Grace's face had not changed. No questions, no comments. Only a slight pause, a flicker in her eyes that Clara could barely detect, but Laura later confirmed on the footage. They placed a hidden camera in the hallway, positioned to capture the entrance, phone table, and coat rack. Another sat tucked inside a hollowed-out book on Clara's shelf, angled toward the living room where most of the Dylan conversations were staged. They installed a virtual phone number that rerouted calls through a secure server, then left a burner phone on the table near the window, open to text notifications from Dylan. Clara spoke aloud about their imaginary dates, their future plans, his hobbies. She even left voicemails on the burner phone while Grace was nearby. Every detail was bait. Within a week, the trap began to close. The first email arrived from an anonymous address, Concerned Friend 84. It warned Dylan that Clara had a history of unstable behavior, including violence. It suggested he look into her past, implying fabricated incidents and hospitalizations. The wording was familiar, almost clinical. Clara showed the email to Laura without saying a word. Laura nodded. Same syntax, same language patterns as the messages Clara's real partners had received years before. Then came the calls. Dylan's phone, monitored through a secured voicemail system, began receiving distorted messages. One simply said, "You don't know who she really is," followed by the sound of a door closing. Another mimicked an official tone, suggesting legal trouble tied to Clara's name. It was textbook psychological interference, and it was all coming from inside the mirrored prison Clara had been raised in. Laura traced the IP address from the email. It was routed through a VPN, but the exit node's location aligned suspiciously with the area of Grace's home. A second email, less careful, slipped through with header data revealing the Wi-Fi network. Andrews art guest. That alone wasn't definitive, but in combination with the rest, it painted a damning picture. Clara began collecting everything: screenshots, recordings, timestamps. Each piece added a layer to the portrait of her mother's compulsive sabotage. It was as if Grace couldn't help herself. The illusion of losing Clara to someone else, even someone who didn't exist, triggered the same reflex she had used for decades. Her instincts operated in darkness, but Clara had finally learned to shine a light. For the first time, the story wasn't just pain or confusion. It was data. It was evidence. Clara didn't yet know what she would do with it. Legal action seemed too thin. Emotional confrontation too volatile. But as she sat with Laura in the glow of a laptop screen, listening to another warped voicemail from the ghost of Dylan, she felt something anchor inside her, a quiet certainty that the ground she stood on was finally real. She had pulled the mirror from the wall, and behind it there was only her mother's reflection. Chapter 4. Beneath the Vault of Lies. Clara sat across from the attorney in a quiet office on the third floor of a modest building near downtown. The walls were lined with framed degrees and soft lamps, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the sharp discomfort in her chest. The lawyer, a calm woman in her 40s who specialized in coercive control and familial psychological abuse, listened carefully as Clara laid out the story. The sabotage, the journals, the fake boyfriend, the recordings. When Clara finished, the woman folded her hands and offered the truth gently, but without illusion. What she had experienced was real, damaging, and traumatic. But in the eyes of the law, it wasn't enough. There had been no restraining orders violated, no physical threats, no public defamation with traceable origin. It was manipulation by implication, control through whispers and anonymous shadows. Legally, Grace had not committed a crime. Ethically, she had demolished boundaries for years. But ethics didn't carry weight in courtrooms. Clara left the office with a folder of resources, some pro bono recommendations, and a sense that justice, at least the kind delivered by legal institutions, would not come. She returned home, sat at her kitchen table, and stared at the pile of printouts Laura had helped organize. Each document was a scream that wouldn't be heard in court. She realized then that she would not find resolution in petitions or protective orders. What her mother had built was not a criminal network. It was a reputation, an image, a fortress of performance. If Clara wanted to dismantle it, she had to pull the mask off in front of everyone Grace still held in her sway. Thanksgiving was approaching. Every year the Andrews family gathered at Grace's house for dinner. A perfectly set table, a photo-worthy turkey, the same toasts, the same smiles. Clara had not attended the last 2 years, but this time she said yes. She planned quietly, methodically. She contacted 3 of her former partners, men who had once held space in her heart and disappeared in fear. 2 responded. 1, Gavin, said he had kept the email he received. Another, Mark, admitted he had been threatened over the phone, but never knew who it was. Both agreed to attend, citing closure as their reason. Clara told them it wouldn't be easy. They told her they didn't care. She sent invitations to extended family under the pretense of a surprise for her mother, a slideshow, a tribute, a chance to honor Grace's lifelong dedication to family. Grace, pleased by the idea, thanked Clara with a note that smelled of perfume and absolution. Clara didn't respond. Laura helped set up the equipment. In the attic above the dining room, they installed a short-throw projector and wireless speakers tucked behind the vintage molding. Clara wired the presentation to her phone, controlled silently, screen by screen. The files were loaded and ready, audio clips, screen captures, anonymized metadata. Everything was packaged in sequence. No commentary, no accusations, just the truth, layered with timestamps and voices and hard evidence. The night arrived cold and brittle. Clara wore black, not as a symbol, but as armor. She arrived early, helped set the table, poured wine for guests she hadn't seen in years. Gavin and Mark sat near the edge of the room, quiet but present. Her mother floated from group to group, radiant in her hosting, oblivious to the cracks in the stage beneath her feet. The room filled with laughter and the clink of silverware. And then Clara stood. She tapped her glass gently and said she had prepared something for the occasion, a short family tribute. The lights dimmed. The screen lowered from the attic hatch. The opening image was a photo of Grace holding infant Clara, smiling. Then the real presentation began. First came the emails, redacted names, identical wording, sent to 3 different men. Then the voicemails, distorted and anonymous, but now exposed. One by one, the slides built the case. Clara let the evidence speak. The room changed. Postures stiffened. Faces turned to Grace. A silence fell so thick that even the creak of floorboards above felt loud. Grace didn't speak, not at first. When the slideshow ended, Clara stood motionless. She looked at no one. Then she turned and walked out the front door into the night air, leaving behind a house full of murmurs, shattered illusions, and one woman who no longer held the script. The mask had cracked, and the performance was over. Chapter 5. The One Who Heard Everything. The house was warm with the scent of rosemary, roasted turkey, and applewood candles. The soft hum of conversation had dwindled to uneasy silence as the screen descended from the attic hatch. The clink of forks against porcelain faded. Clara stood at the far end of the room, her hands resting at her sides, eyes steady. She didn't make a speech. She didn't explain. She only pressed play. The room dimmed as the projector flickered to life. The first slide was harmless, a childhood photo of Clara sitting on Grace's lap, both smiling in summer light. It lingered for a breath, then dissolved into something darker. An email appeared on screen. Then another, all anonymous. All written in the same clipped, methodical tone. Warnings, insinuations, character assassination. Clara didn't narrate. The sequence unfolded automatically. Screenshots of messages sent to Dylan. Threats that mirrored what Gavin and Mark had once received. The same phrases, the same patterns. The next slide played audio. A distorted voice, female, calm but chilling. "You don't know what she's capable of. She breaks people." The cadence was unmistakable. Grace's, processed just enough to obscure, but not enough to protect. The room had fallen still. Somewhere near the back, someone's fork clattered against a plate. Then came the final slide, a timeline. A line drawn across a calendar with dots marking when each of Clara's relationships had ended. Each dot aligned with digital evidence. Emails sent, calls placed. Clara stood beside it all like a witness to her own life. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Gavin stood, his voice flat and deliberate. He said he'd received the exact same kind of emails. He admitted they'd terrified him. He thought Clara had a stalker. He didn't imagine it would be her own mother. Mark followed. He said the messages made him believe she was dangerous. He'd even considered filing a restraining order, but felt too ashamed of his own fear to follow through. He apologized, quietly, then sat down again. The silence shifted, from shock to disorientation. Eyes moved toward Grace. She didn't speak at first. Her hands were still folded neatly in her lap, her expression fixed, but her shoulders had stiffened. Then she stood. Her voice, when it came, was sharp, precise. She said Clara had twisted everything, that none of them understood. That she had done what she had to do, because she loved her daughter, because men like those always wanted one thing, and Clara was too naive to see it. She insisted that all she'd ever done was protect her from being used, discarded, ruined. The words fell flat. No one defended her. Some looked away. Others stared at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. Grace's voice rose, brittle and trembling. She called it betrayal. She said she had given Clara everything, her time, her energy, her whole life. She said she had sacrificed. She demanded to know why that wasn't enough. Clara met her gaze calmly. Her voice didn't shake. She said that what Grace called love was something else entirely, that it had never been about protection, only about possession. She said Grace hadn't loved her. She had feared losing control, and now she had lost it. Then Clara turned and walked toward the door. Her shoes moved soundlessly over the old rug, the same rug that had once cushioned childhood games and family photos. No one followed. No one stopped her. When the door closed behind her, the house remained silent. The projector screen still hung from the attic. The candles burned low, and somewhere upstairs, the attic recorded the silence that followed, as if listening, just in case someone decided to finally say the truth out loud. Chapter 6: Warmth After the Freeze. A soft rain fell on Portland that morning, misting the windows and tracing beads across the glass. The city moved slowly in the early light, buses breathing quietly at street corners, bicycles streaking past in the blur of silver puddles. Inside a sunlit apartment on the third floor of a narrow building near the university, Clara made coffee and stood barefoot on the wooden floor, listening to the sound of water and wind. It had been a year since she left Minnesota, a year since the silence in her mother's house had closed behind her like a heavy door. She never went back. There had been no apologies, no attempts to reclaim what had fractured. The absence was its own kind of peace. The apartment was small, filled with warm earth tones and light. Shelves of books lined the walls, literature, psychology, folklore. The space smelled faintly of paper and jasmine. In the bedroom, a single drawing hung above the desk, a bird in mid-flight, rising from the bars of an open cage. Laura had given it to her the week she moved. It was the only image from the past she allowed to remain. Clara worked at the university's Special Collections Department, curating old manuscripts and digital archives. She loved the quiet hum of the reading room, the feel of old paper, the patience of detail. Her days were measured and calm. There was no more second-guessing, no more checking her phone for messages that might turn love into threat. Sometimes postcards arrived with no return address. One showed a snowy field, another an empty beach at dusk. always a single phrase scrawled in familiar, looping handwriting, never signed. She read them without fear. They no longer reached inside her. They were echoes from a place she no longer lived in. She had met someone too. His name was Thomas, a philosophy lecturer with quiet eyes and a weathered leather satchel. He knew her story, not the watered-down version, but the truth. She had told him early, half expecting him to pull away. But he hadn't. He listened. He stayed. And more importantly, he never tried to fix her. They built something steady. No grand declarations, no sudden vanishing acts. Just quiet mornings, shared books, and a dog-eared map above their bed with pins for every place they hoped to visit. Clara no longer thought of love as a test or a reward. It wasn't something to earn or survive. It was presence. It was safety. It was being seen without fear of being rewritten. She didn't hate Grace. That emotion had lost its shape over time. What remained was something quieter, recognition perhaps, or grief for what could never be repaired. But she also no longer looked back, hoping to understand. That work was done. Clara finished her coffee, slipped on her coat, and stepped out into the morning. The air was cool, but not cold. And for the first time in a long time, the season ahead didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to step into, with both hands open.